Welcome to Intentional Aging for July 2023. Joining us today is Anne Marie Wells. Anne Marie is a poet, an author, and a teacher. She's currently serving as the lead faculty member for the DC chapter of the Community Literature Initiative through the Sims Library of Poetry. She's also the Strategic Partnership Fellow for the Poetry Lab. She has won numerous poetry awards and contests, and she recently published a memoir in verse, which is available to be placed on hold in the Knowles catalog, which is titled Survived By, and evolved from her own journey through grief over the loss of her father. So today she is here with us to share the ways that creative writing can be used to process grief and loss. So Anne Marie, welcome to Intentional Aging. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, and thank you, Karina. So I'm going to introduce some writing exercises that I have implemented in my own writing craft that has helped me process all of my thoughts, emotions surrounding loss. And I'm here to share those with you and share some examples and give everybody some time to try those exercises for yourself. So you can write out longhand with a pen and paper, or you can type on your computer if that's more comfortable. I'm going to be doing the exercises with you at the exact same time. So Karina already went through the land acknowledgement. I have my own, but we'll move forward since we've already done that. And I would also like to take a moment to just acknowledge that I'm not a licensed psychologist, social worker, or counselor. The writing exercises and techniques that I'm introducing can be considered therapeutic, but they are not intended to be therapy. They are just techniques and exercises that have helped me personally navigate my own grief and pain, and I'm here to share those with you. I also know that writing about loss or writing about negative experiences from the past may trigger people and bring up things for folks that maybe they weren't prepared to think about or have in the forefront of their brain. And I want to just say, if that happens for you and you need to leave, I won't be offended. Or if you need to turn off your sound or keep your camera off, that is totally fine. This session is for you, and you make it whatever you want it to be. And if it's not serving you, then please do what you need to do to take care of yourself. And I also have some resources here that if you do want to talk to somebody who is a professional counselor, then these are some resources, and I'll have those up during the writing prompt time as well. A little bit about me. Karina did mention that I'm a poet, playwright, memoirist, storyteller. My book that was just published is called Survive By. This is my proof copy, which is why it says it's not for resale, but it does more or less look like this, minus the band across the center. I also have a couple of books coming out next year. So I have another memoir, not in verse, about my travels through Iceland, coming out with Wild Dog Press, and then another poetry chapbook coming out in the spring of 2024. And if you are interested in following me on that journey, you can check out my website or follow me on social media if any of you are social media enthusiasts. I am also teaching a poetry publishing course. It's a 2-semester course with the Community Literature Initiative. And if you're interested in that, you can reach out to me as well. All right. So just to get things started and to get the juices flowing, we're just going to spend a couple minutes writing about what delighted you today or recently. You can write a list, you can write it in paragraph style. This is just an exercise that helps get the cobwebs out and also helps get our brain in a mode for writing. So we're just going to take a few minutes. I'm going to put 3 minutes on my timer and go. All right, next time. So let's move on. The title of my workshop is called Synonyms for Grief. I titled that workshop after this poem by K.E. Ogden that I'm going to read for you now. Daddy used to cup his hands at my ear so I could hear the river. Every time the world stops, something is lost. A field of dogs shouts at the deer in the dark trees. Empty sky night. We buried the pig in a pit, and now we're standing around the fire with cans of bud. Pull off one ear and then another. These are synonyms for grief. Door, dirt, potato salad, whiskey, cigarettes, shovel, biscuits, pine logs, fried chicken, cigarette smoke, grits, porch, that big wild oak tree, that pecan tree with its lightning split trunk still giving seed. This is a name for sadness, a mechanical butterfly caught in a jar, and if you press this button, it will push again and again against the glass. Open the door, beneath that space in the door, no gravity. People speak in thought balloons. Daddy said, when I die, just throw me in the ditch. The elements that stood out to me in this poem when I first read it were these lines. These are synonyms for grief. Door, dirt, potato salad, this list of items that for me, I don't know what those mean. I don't know how these specific items are even significant to the speaker in the poem or the author of the poem. But it made me think about what my own synonyms for grief are. What are the objects in my life that when I see them, they invoke feelings of loss? What are the things that I associate with my loved ones who have passed on, who I think about every time I think about potato salad or fried chicken or the porch? But what are those elements to me specifically? The other thing that I noticed are the lines, this is a name for sadness, a mechanical butterfly caught in a jar. Again, I don't know what the significance these lines are for the writer of the poem, but what I do know is this idea of naming sadness. This is a name for sadness. I've never thought to name my sadness or to think of what it could be named or what could be synonymous with sadness in a way that's outside of a standard thesaurus entry. So the first writing prompt, and this will be a series of prompts that we work on together at the end of this section. But the first questions are going to be, what are your synonyms for grief? What is another name for your sadness? And we'll come back to this at the end of this section. But let's take a look at another poem. This one is by Annie Marifka, The Ways We Celebrate Your Birthday After You Die. The first birthday after you died, we partied, as we thought you would have wanted us to. Silly paper hats and Mardi Gras beads, and shots of tequila with lines to chase, bar hopping until our heads filled with fuzz, and Pat's words became blurry, and Justin had to lean on the bar in order to get through the tale of that time you went to a toga party dressed in a clear plastic shower curtain instead of a sheet. The 17th birthday, after you died, I sit alone at my dining table, sipping on your favorite liqueur, holding that picture of you in your shower curtain toga, the plastic rings, a necklace, your toothy grin, an aching throb in my gut that I can't share with anyone because it's been too long for me to still be grieving publicly. Because what if you can see me and I don't celebrate and you're angry at me? Because what if I forget you? This poem is completely different than the first one. The elements in this poem that I particularly noticed was the two sections, the first birthday after you died, the 17th birthday after you died, and the differences between the first stanza and the second stanza, the kind of before and after. We partied before. I sit alone at my dining table. Shots of tequila with limes to chase versus sipping on your favorite liqueur. Even the connotations with these two images, shots of tequila with limes to chase, we're imagining a lot of people around, maybe kind of like carelessness, like, yes, let's have another, not keeping track of how many. Sipping on your favorite liqueur feels very intentional. There's an intentional choice there of not just sipping on red wine, sipping on whiskey neat. It's sipping on your favorite liqueur. The idea of the first stanza incorporating other people, Pat and Justin were also there. But now in this second stanza, I can't share with anyone, maybe not even with Pat and Justin who were there in the beginning. So this second prompt, the second question is, how would you define grief if its definition lied within the differences between how life is today compared to what it was in the past? Even if it's a before the event, after the event, or maybe shortly after the event and much later after the event. This will be another question that we come back to, but I just want to take a look at one more poem. And this is one that I wrote. And grief sometimes isn't just about death and loss, but grief can also be about losing a dream, something that is missing from life, or something that that you wish that isn't quite there. And this poem is about that. No handprints on mirrors, no Play-Doh crusted into carpet, no penciled scribbles on the wall to mark each year of growth. I sleep through the night, only wake for the bathroom. No tiny voice cries for me to save them from a nightmare. I peek through the door to the other room. It's empty, except for boxes of winter clothes and photo albums. I leave my lipsticks and perfume strewn around the sink with my bobby pins. No pint-sized toothbrush leans against mine. No toys and primary colors line the tub's edge. No shampoo for sensitive eyes. I've never sighed over wet towels in a heap on the bathroom floor or vacuumed crumbs out of the creases of a car seat. Never folded laundry that wasn't my own. Never bleached a karate gi. Never listened to a hissing violin with a smile. No Mickey Mouse bandages in the first aid kit. My lips have never touched a bruise. I leave candles lit on the nightstand. Eat popcorn for dinner in front of the TV. The table in the kitchen has only one chair. I don't remind anyone to chew with mouth closed or that breakfast is the most important meal of the day. Maybe I'll fly to Portugal just because. Dance to fado or shop for ceramic whatever and cork such and such. No one needs me to pack their tuna fish and potato chip sandwich before school or to kiss them goodbye before they run to the bus. No one asks if I can read the monster at the end of this book 4 times before they fall asleep. No one weeps in my absence. I go by no other name. I worry over no one. No one worries over me. And so with this poem, the question is, what are your synonyms for grief if they are a list of things that are missing from your everyday life? And so now we'll go into our first writing time. What are the synonyms for your grief? Does your sadness have a name? How would you define grief if its definition lied within the differences between how life is today compared to what it was in the past? What are your synonyms for grief if they are a list of things that are missing from your everyday life? And if those questions don't speak to you today, then you can answer whatever your heart needs to get out on paper. Are there any questions before we start? So I'll put my screen back on and I'm going to set my timer for 5 minutes. Okay. we have just under 30 seconds left. I like to make notes of where I am so that I can come back to it if I have other ideas of where I want to take my writing. Then I make those little notes before I forget. All right, and we're going to go into our second writing exercise. This one is a little bit different. So the first part is to just make a list of words that delight you. You can take words from your writing prompt earlier, or you can create a whole new list of words. This is a list that can be as an example, but they'll be unique to you. It can be things that bring you joy, or it can just be words that you like the sound of them. Whatever you want. So we're going to take 1 minute to write a list of words that delight you, starting now. All right, and that's time. So now with those list of words, we're going to be using them in this exercise. Sometimes when we aren't ready to tell our story, we're not able to express it at all. Sometimes we try to bury it deep down, and then it can fester there, or it never truly healed because it hasn't been let out. Or sometimes there are negative emotions like fear or guilt or shame that can force those stories to stay within us because we don't feel like we can share them with others. We feel vulnerable. We don't feel safe sharing those. We're afraid of judgment, lack of understanding, lack of empathy. Or they're just too personal. Maybe you don't have fear, guilt, or shame, but they're just too personal to share. And so I've created the following exercise that is a way for a hard story to be transformed into a poem. And this is just, for your own personal journey. So it's not with any intention of necessarily sharing it, which you're more than welcome to share, but you don't have to. This is just a method that I have used to be able to let go of hard stories that I've been holding on to. So for example, we're going to start out just thinking about a thing that is hard to say out loud, something that might cause fear. I'm afraid of this. Something that might cause shame. This happened. Or something that causes guilt, or something that makes you feel vulnerable in some way. You don't even have to write it out. You can just think about it. So for example, my husband is an alcoholic. I'm not sad my mother is dead. I knew my sister was bulimic. I don't love my son. Those are things that people might not want to say out loud. They're hard for them to express, but they're held deep inside of them. So we're going to take the hard thing that we're thinking about, but then we're going to add specificity. So for example, my husband is an alcoholic, gets transformed into 2 different men live in my house, Phil and drunk Phil. I never know who I'm coming home to. There is the specificity. My mother once told me I was a mistake, that she couldn't imagine me amounting to anything in this life. I wonder who I would have been if my mother was loving. I could hear my sister throwing up in the bathroom, could see her red, teary face when she'd walk out. I was only 8, but still knew she needed help. I don't know how to love a liar, a thief, someone who looks me straight in the face and tells me they're clean when they're not. I wish I never had my son. But now we're going to replace some of the words in the phrase that it's hard to say with some of the words that delight you. It's a way of writing in code. You know what you're writing about. But if someone else were to read it, it would just be kind of like nonsensical phrases. But then those nonsensical phrases can be expanded into a poem. And I'll show you what I mean. It's a way of expressing yourself with a sort of shield for when you're not ready to be exposed. 2 different wilds live in my house. The wild of blankets and the wild of windows. I never quiet the stained glass I'm coming home to paint. My German Shepherd once told me I was home, that she couldn't imagine me singing to rocking chairs in this life. I wonder who I would have been if my poetry was read. I could hear my sister dressing in the outdoors, could see her red cheesecake short sleeves when she'd walk out of the picnic. I was only 8, but still knew she needed to whistle. I don't know how to cuddle a carousel a summer, someone who looks me straight in the face and tells me they're grass when they're rice pudding. I wish I never quieted my independence. So after you have this kind of nonsensical phrase, then you can work on expanding that into a poem. Sometimes it's helpful to ask, what happened before this? Or what happened after this? Or if you find that many of your words carry a similar theme, then you can utilize different vernacular within that theme to keep going with your poem. So for example, I'm going to share with you a poem that I wrote using this exercise. And what I found was that there was a lot of musical words that I was using. And so I abandoned my original list of delightful words and focused on utilizing words that were more in the realm of music and words associated with music. There really are no rules. This is just an exercise for you to be able to express things that maybe historically have been challenging or impossible to do. Here's my poem. It doesn't have a title, and this poem is not in my book. This is more of just an exercise. I sat at my piano to play for him. The look in his eyes when the notes floated from the strings in tiny bubbles. I couldn't stop. It couldn't stop singing at the side of his bed while he tossed his fingers around like a metronome and released a hum as if there were lyrics to the tune. I didn't look away, not while his hand still held mine. And I'd never let the clouds know this is how it happened. I hope he knew I'd never whistle without him, would never even dream of it. So when I read this poem out loud to folks, I know that it sounds very surreal, nonsensical. It doesn't have a clear meaning of what is happening in this scene, but that's not the point. The point was only for me to get out some thoughts and feelings that had been stuck inside in a way that felt comfortable because I knew people wouldn't know what I was talking about. But I do. And every time that I read this poem, it feels a little bit more like a release to me. So as we go into our next writing prompt, and we'll take a little bit longer for this one because there are multiple parts. We're going to think about the thing that is hard to say out loud. We're going to add specificity to that thing. Then we're going to replace some of the words that are hard to say or maybe are identifying, and we're going to replace them with words that delight us. From there, when we have our nonsensical phrase, from there, you're invited to expand the poem. You can ask yourself what happened before this, what happened after. You can also create a series of things that are difficult to say, replacing the words and having kind of disjointed stanzas of poetry. It's up to you, and there are no rules. I'll put this back up, but I'll take it down for just a moment just to ask if there are any questions before we go into this writing time for this exercise. Okay, I'm going to put my screen back up, and this time we're going to take 7 minutes. All right, and once again, make notes to yourself if you want to come back to this exercise, where you left off and where you'd like to come back to. All right, we're going to go into our last exercise. All right, so we're going to be talking about the prose poem, which if you're not familiar with a prose poem, it's essentially a poem that doesn't have line breaks. It's usually written as a solid block of text. You see it and it just looks like a paragraph on a page. When reading it, we take a breath at traditional punctuation. Sometimes when we're reading poems that have line breaks, we take breaths at the punctuation. Other times we take breaths at the line breaks themselves. With prose poems, because there are no line breaks and it just goes to the margin, we typically just follow traditional punctuation. They're usually short, maybe one stanza, but sometimes they come in a series of stanzas. So it's like a series of individual poems in these blocks of text. They still employ poetic language. So they're not a speech, they're not a litany, they're not an essay, they're not technical language or a scientific article. It's still considered poetry because of the poetic nature and also because they tend to be short. So you're not usually going to find, you wouldn't necessarily call a novel a long poem unless it's an epic like the Iliad or something, but those were originally written in verse. And in English translation, they don't follow that same kind of verse rhyming scheme that they once did, 1,000 years ago. But you'll sometimes find prose poems in series where you might have 5 different poems and they might be on different topics or they might be on similar topics, but they're individual and they're broken up. So we'll take a look at a couple of examples. Before we go into that, so prose poems have helped me in writing, and I have a couple in my book, to be able to tell a story of bearing witness. And sometimes writing in first person, I did this, I saw this, I experienced this, can feel too challenging or vulnerable. And so writing in second or third person can help us to write it out because it'll indicate even more to our own brains that we're writing a story and that we're not necessarily writing our own story. It's writing about a story that happened to you or a story that happened to her or to him. It's not something that happened to me. And sometimes in writing prose poetry, I have changed what has happened in the story. I wrote about what I wished happened instead, changing the details, changing the ending. And I want to invite everybody to do the same thing because poems aren't meant to be journalism. It does not matter if you change what happens because you're creating art rather than a historical document or a scientific article. Facts are the fodder for the art, but your poetic license and your own artistic interpretation is what the art itself is. So if writing out the story, bearing witness to your grief, doesn't feel like something that you're ready to do just yet, then don't do it. Write about something else or kind of walk around the subject, writing about the different elements that happened at the time, what the weather was like, maybe what you were wearing, where you were, or writing, this is where she was, this is what he was doing, and not focusing on yourself. We're going to take a look at a couple of examples. This is an excerpt from the Book of Micah by Joshua Bennett. This does contain images of police violence, just if you need to do what you need to do. This is a prose poem that is from a series. There's 5 or 6 different of these blocks of text that take a look at a greater story, and this is the last one within that series. General consensus has it he was looking for his little cousin and found him. even before the initial cop car ran like a living ram through the people. Before the boys in blue sprang a spray of navy flechettes from behind its doors. Before they were caught in the scuffle, released 10 to 20 rounds of ammo into the crowd without warning, bullets glancing off of cutlass doors and corner store glass built for battle, all but 3 or 4 of which entered the boy mid-stride, lifted his 6-foot frame from the ground, legs still pumping. For a second, you would almost swear he was running through the gunfire, preparing for liftoff or something. Baby cousin held firmly in his arms, shielded from the onslaught. They never would have caught him if he hadn't been holding that child, said no one, though we all thought it during the weeks following that moment we each froze. The moment his body collapsed low as petals upon the unremarkable cement. And we stared at our champion felled by an outcome so common we don't even have a special name for it still. No one standing ran that day. Most of us turned to face his killers, hands at our sides, determined to make them make it a massacre. But all that was before we heard Man let off a scream so full it rent the crowd in two, split the circle we had built around the boy's corpse, our human wall parting to watch each casing fall from Micah's still wet, dark red sweatshirt out onto the street. Hear me. I heard the gunman's greeting, saw hollow points etch apertures into the boy's clothes. They shot Micah Dudley, quite legally. He died that night. He rose. So this poem is an example of bearing witness to a traumatic event and writing in from his own point of view, but in the crowd of many. So from using us and our versus I, though he does use I sometimes. So using I, us, and our as the point of view. This next one we're going to take a look at uses the second person as the point of view to give you an example of what that could look like. This is an excerpt from Andrea Gibson's poem, Hurt the Fly. Your therapist asks you how you're feeling, and you say you're sick of talking about the symptoms. There's an arrow through your sternum, and you're being asked how it feels, how you're planning to work with the arrow there, how you're planning to breathe in a crowded room. You just want the arrow out, want to grab the past and tear it from your body, even if it takes your organs with it. There are lists for new organs, no lists for new pasts. How little you were when you started wanting your mother to love you less so it wouldn't kill her to know you'd been hurt. You still can't stomach telling the truth without some bungee in the noose, without saying the worst thing that ever happened to you was not the worst thing that ever happened to you, hating yourself for it. Your therapist says, you blame yourself so you can believe the world is a safe place, or it would be if only you had done things differently. It's kind of sweet, actually, what you've given to believe in the goodness of the world, your own good name, your own good light, your own wise and grown life, all traded for a galaxy that wouldn't hurt a fly. Now, I don't know if Andrea wrote this poem from their own point of view or if it is actually talking about somebody else, but it doesn't matter. It's only an example of how a poem can be written by using the second person point of view as an example. So our last writing prompt that we're going to go into, and this time we're going to take 10 minutes. We're going to write a prose poem that bears witness to our grief. And we can write in second or third person if that feels more comfortable. And I want to invite you to lie if you want to. It doesn't have to be absolutely exactly what happened. The details can be blurred, the ending can be what you wished had happened instead. This is only a poem, and it's only for you and for no one else if you want it to be that way. All right, we're gonna, I will stop share briefly just to make sure. Are there any questions before we go into this last writing prompt? Okay, I'll put the prompt back up and I'm going to put 10 minutes on the clock. All right. It's less than 10 seconds, so I'll ask you to make notes to yourself about where you might want to take this next. And then just want to say thank you. And if you enjoyed this workshop, then you can join another workshop that I'm going to be hosting on August 8th that is also virtual through the Poetry Lab. That is on poems inspired by other poems, but how to do it so that you're not plagiarizing. That's called The After Poem. And you can find that at thepoetrylab.com. You can also look into joining my community literature initiative class. That's the 2-semester class, and I can put those links in the chat. I know that your library is already going to have my book in your library, but you can suggest it for your book club. And if you do read it, then you can write a review on your social media or on Goodreads or on Amazon.